Gilligan's Island looks deceptively simple. 7 castaways, a sinking boat, and a tropical island with no way home. But behind that cheerful premise lies a story far stranger than anything that aired on screen. Hidden production secrets, cast tensions that nearly derailed the show before launch, and decisions that quietly shaped television history. This was no ordinary comedy. 3 seasons on air somehow turned into decades of cultural reach, and it all starts with a secret that stayed buried for nearly 30 years, a beginning so different that most fans had no idea it even existed. Number 1. The pilot nobody saw for 30 years. Before a single episode reached living rooms across America, a version of this show already existed, one that most fans would never see. The original pilot was filmed in 1963, well ahead of the series premiere, and it featured a cast and tone that felt noticeably different from what audiences would eventually come to love. CBS took one look at the footage and rejected it, deciding the show needed significant changes before it was ready for broadcast. What made it different wasn't just the casting, the overall feel was rougher, less polished, and missing some of the characters that would later define the series. Rather than reshoot everything from scratch, the network held the footage in storage while they reworked the format. The pilot didn't disappear, but it didn't see the light of day in any official capacity for a very long time. It wasn't until 1992, nearly 3 decades later, that the original pilot finally aired. Fans who had grown up watching reruns suddenly discovered that the show they thought they knew had a hidden origin. Seeing it for the first time was a strange experience, familiar in some ways yet unmistakably different. It was a reminder that the version of Gilligan's Island that became a television classic wasn't quite the one its creators first imagined. Number 2. Renewed, then canceled overnight. Few things sting more in television than cancellation, but being canceled after already being renewed is a different kind of blow entirely. Gilligan's Island had reportedly been greenlit for a 4th season, with the cast and crew fully expecting to return. Then, almost without warning, CBS reversed course and pulled the plug, leaving everyone caught completely off guard. The reason behind the sudden change had little to do with ratings and everything to do with network politics. CBS needed to make room for a new show backed by influential executives, and the slot that had belonged to the castaways was simply given away. The decision was made so late that there was no time to craft a proper finale. No rescue, no resolution, just the close of another ordinary episode. The result was one of television's most famously incomplete endings. Audiences had tuned in week after week, always expecting the castaways to eventually find their way home, only to have the series stop without any closure whatsoever. The abrupt cancellation became a running joke in pop culture for years, and it was ultimately one of the driving reasons fans and producers kept returning to the story. Through movies, cartoons, and reunion specials, all trying to give these characters the ending they never got. Number 3. The Minnow was a hidden industry joke. Not every joke lands in the dialogue. Some are hidden in plain sight, right in the name of a boat. The SS Minnow, the vessel that carries the castaways to their fate, wasn't named by accident. It was a deliberate dig at Newton Minnow, the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, the government body responsible for overseeing all of American broadcasting. Minnow had made headlines in 1961 when he delivered a speech to the National Association of Broadcasters and declared that American television was a vast wasteland. He wasn't speaking as an outside critic. He was the most powerful regulatory figure in the industry, the man whose office held real authority over what networks could and couldn't do. Creator Sherwood Schwartz was far from impressed, and he found a quiet but pointed way to express that. By naming the boat the SS Minnow, Schwartz ensured that the vessel responsible for stranding these characters, the one that sinks and ruins everything, would carry Minnow's name forever. Every time the theme song played and the boat went down, it was a subtle jab at the man who had dismissed television as worthless. It's one of the sharpest hidden jokes in TV history, and most viewers watching at home had absolutely no idea it was even there. Number 4. The rest sparked a fan backlash. A theme song is supposed to welcome viewers into a show's world, but for 2 cast members, the original version of the Gilligan's Island theme felt more like a deliberate slight. When the series launched, the song wrapped up by naming the skipper, Gilligan, the millionaire, his wife, and the movie star, then lumped the professor and Marianne together as simply the rest. No names, no acknowledgement, just the rest. Dawn Wells, who played Marianne, and Russell Johnson, who played the professor, were understandably unhappy about being left out. Their characters were part of the ensemble just as much as anyone else, yet the song treated them as an afterthought. The omission didn't go unnoticed by audiences either, and complaints began to build as the show gained popularity across the country. Eventually, the lyrics were updated to include both characters by name, correcting what had always been a strange and unnecessary oversight. The change turned a small production decision into a genuine piece of TV history, a rare case where cast pushback and audience feedback led to a lasting fix. Today, most viewers don't even know there was ever a version where 2 of the 7 castaways weren't deemed worth naming. Number 5. JFK's death disrupted the pilot. Some productions carry the weight of history in ways nobody planned for. When cast and crew were deep into filming the original pilot, news broke that President John F. Kennedy had been shot in Dallas. It was November 22, 1963, one of the most devastating days in modern American history, and work on the set stopped almost immediately as the reality of what had happened began to sink in. Filming was suspended as the nation went into mourning. Schedules were thrown into disarray and the production had to pause while everyone processed the news. But that day left behind more than just disrupted logistics. It left a visible mark on the footage itself. In some of the early pilot material, a flag can be spotted flying at half-staff in the background, a quiet and unintentional reminder of exactly when that footage was captured. The pilot was never meant to carry that kind of historical weight, but it does. For anyone watching the footage today with that knowledge in mind, that flag takes on an entirely different significance. What was shot as a lighthearted comedy pilot became, in a small way, a document of one of America's darkest days. It's the kind of detail that could easily go unnoticed, but once seen, it's impossible to forget. Number 6. Ginger nearly walked off the show. Playing a glamorous movie star on a stranded island sounds like a dream role, but for the actress behind the character, the reality was far more complicated. Tina Louise had signed on to play Ginger with a specific vision in mind, a fully developed dramatic role with real depth and screen presence. What she found instead was a character being shaped more for broad comedy than the serious, layered performance she had anticipated delivering. The frustration grew as the show's tone became clearer. Louise felt the role was drifting away from what she had been led to expect, and tensions between her vision for Ginger and the direction the producers were taking began to surface. There were real concerns that she might walk away entirely before the show had even found its footing with audiences. The ensemble dynamic, already being carefully constructed, was at risk of unraveling before it had a chance to work. Ultimately, she stayed, and Ginger became one of the most recognizable characters in the entire series. But the friction never fully disappeared behind the scenes. Louise would later speak openly about her complicated relationship with the show and the role, and her decision not to return for the reunion movies decades later made a great deal more sense in the light of that long-running tension. What audiences saw on screen as effortless charm had a much more complicated story running quietly beneath it. Number 7. One actress recast, one character erased. The cast that audiences came to know so well didn't arrive fully formed. It was the result of deliberate changes made after the original pilot was filmed and rejected. 2 of the most significant shifts involved the female characters, and together they reshaped the entire personality of the show. The version of Ginger seen in the pilot was played by an actress named Kit Smythe, who brought a different energy to the role before Tina Louise was brought in to redefine it from the ground up. The even bigger change was the complete removal of a character that most fans have never heard of. Mary Ann, cheerful, grounded, beloved, didn't exist in the original pilot at all. Her spot was occupied by a character named Bunny, a secretary whose role didn't land the way producers had hoped. Rather than simply recast the part, the decision was made to erase Bunny entirely and build a new character from scratch, one who would offer a completely different kind of energy within the group. Dawn Wells was cast as Mary Ann, and the contrast she brought compared to Bunny helped balance the ensemble in a way the pilot version hadn't achieved. The shift also created one of television's most enduring pop culture debates, the Ginger versus Mary Ann question that fans argued about for decades. None of that conversation would have existed if Bunny had simply been recast rather than replaced. It's a small production decision that quietly shaped television history. Number 8. The theme song replaced episode 1. Most television shows ease their audience in with a first episode that sets up the world, the characters, and the central premise. Gilligan's Island took a completely different approach, one that was partly creative and partly a practical solution to an unusual problem. With the original pilot rejected and no straightforward way to introduce 7 characters to a brand new audience, the producers came up with something that would prove far more durable than any single episode ever could. The theme song was written to do the work that episode 1 never got to do. Every verse introduced the castaways, explained the setup, and told listeners exactly how these 7 people ended up stranded on a deserted island. CBS accepted this as a legitimate storytelling device, essentially signing off on the idea that a catchy song could replace a full narrative introduction. It was an unconventional move, but the network was willing to try it. What nobody fully anticipated was just how effective it would turn out to be. Decades after the show left the air, people who had never watched a single episode could still hum the tune and recite the basic premise from memory. The theme song didn't just solve a production problem, it became the show's most powerful piece of storytelling. Every time it played, It did exactly what it was designed to do, introducing the world of the island to whoever happened to be watching, whether for the first time or the 100th. Number 9. Critics thought it would fail. There's a long history of television critics getting it spectacularly wrong, and few cases are more striking than the early reception to this show. When Gilligan's Island launched in 1964, the critical community was largely unimpressed. The premise, 7 strangers stranded on an island with no rescue in sight, struck many reviewers as too lightweight, too absurd, and too thin to sustain a full series. The consensus among those paid to evaluate such things was that audiences would quickly lose interest. The reviews were dismissive at best and openly mocking at worst. Critics questioned whether the show had any real comedic value beyond its basic novelty, and some predicted it would be gone before the season was out. The idea that a show built entirely around characters who never actually solved their central problem, getting off the island, could hold an audience week after week seemed genuinely difficult to defend on paper. Viewers disagreed completely. Ratings were strong from the start, and the audience that showed up for the premiere kept coming back. The show ran for 3 seasons and then, through the power of syndication, reached even larger audiences in reruns than it had ever managed during its original broadcast run. The gap between what the critics expected and what actually happened became one of the more memorable lessons in the history of television, proof that sometimes the simplest ideas connect with people in ways that no reviewer can predict in advance. Number 10. The island was a Hollywood lagoon. There's something deeply satisfying about the illusion of a deserted tropical island. Warm light, swaying palms, water lapping against a pristine shore. For viewers watching at home, the setting felt convincingly remote and sun-soaked. The reality, however, was considerably less exotic. Almost everything seen on screen was filmed on a purpose-built lagoon located on a studio lot in Los Angeles, about as far from a deserted island as it's possible to get while still being in California. The lagoon was constructed specifically to give the production a controlled environment where weather, lighting, and logistics could all be managed without the unpredictability of a real outdoor location. Sets could be built around it, camera angles could be carefully chosen to hide the fact that civilization was just a short distance away, and filming could proceed on a tight schedule without the chaos that came with genuine remote shooting. For a series cranking out a large number of episodes per season, that kind of reliability was invaluable. What made the illusion work wasn't just the physical construction of the set, it was the skill with which the crew framed every shot to protect the fantasy. The palm trees were real enough, the water caught the light convincingly, and with the right camera placement, nothing gave away the truth. Audiences never had a reason to question it, and most never did. It was only years later, when the behind-the-scenes story began to emerge, that viewers discovered the castaways' island paradise had been sitting in a Los Angeles studio lot the entire time. Number 11. Fog forced them off real beaches. Before the studio lagoon became the show's permanent home, producers had a different vision entirely. Early plans called for filming on actual California beaches, leaning into the natural environment to sell the tropical setting. It seemed like a reasonable approach. Real sand, real water, real horizon. What the production team hadn't fully accounted for was the coastal weather that regularly rolls in along the Southern California shoreline and refuses to cooperate with any filming schedule. Fog was the enemy. Dense marine layer would descend on the beaches with little warning, killing the light and making it impossible to maintain any visual consistency from one shot to the next. Scenes that needed to look sunny and tropical came out gray and flat, and the unpredictability of it meant that entire shooting days could be lost waiting for conditions to improve. For a production already operating on a tight schedule, that kind of disruption was simply unsustainable. The decision to abandon real beach locations and move fully into a controlled studio environment was a direct response to those early frustrations. What felt like a compromise at the time turned out to be one of the more practical production choices the show ever made. The studio lagoon offered something no real beach could: complete control. No fog, no unexpected weather, no lost shooting days. The island that audiences believed was a sun-drenched tropical paradise was, in large part, a response to California's thoroughly uncooperative coastline. Number 12. Traffic noise ruined island silence. Moving to a studio lagoon solved the weather problem, but it introduced an entirely different kind of headache, one that nobody had thought to consider when the location was chosen. The lagoon sat in close proximity to a busy freeway, and the steady roar of passing traffic had a habit of drifting directly onto the set at exactly the wrong moments. For a show built around the illusion of a remote, uninhabited island, the sound of rush hour was a particularly awkward intrusion. Production crews quickly learned to work around the problem, but it required a level of scheduling creativity that added real friction to the filming process. During peak traffic hours, recording dialogue outdoors became almost impossible. Scenes would be paused mid-shoot while the sound team waited for a gap in the noise, and in some cases the entire production day had to be reorganized to front-load filming before the roads got busy, or push it later until traffic thinned out again. It's one of those behind-the-scenes realities that creates a strange mental image for anyone who has ever watched the show. The same scenes where the castaways would gaze across the water and sigh about being lost in the middle of nowhere were being filmed within earshot of commuters heading home after work. The isolation was entirely constructed, not just visually, but orally. Every tranquil moment on that island required the crew to hold its breath and wait for Los Angeles to quiet down long enough to capture it. Number 13. Bob Denver filmed in freezing water. The physical demands of a comedy set are rarely discussed with the same seriousness as those of an action production. But that doesn't mean the work is without its own genuine discomforts. For the actor playing Gilligan, the lagoon was a recurring source of misery that had nothing to do with storylines or script challenges. The water in the studio lagoon could reach uncomfortably cold temperatures, and the role required regular immersion in it throughout the production run. Bob Denver's solution was practical, if unglamorous. Beneath the famous white sailor hat and red shirt, he wore a wetsuit to insulate himself against the cold during water-heavy scenes. It was a hidden layer that never made it on screen, carefully concealed under his costume so that nothing disrupted the visual of Gilligan tumbling cheerfully into the water yet again. The audience saw slapstick. What was actually happening was an actor doing his best to stay warm enough to get through the scene. It's a small detail, but it adds real texture to the performance. The physical comedy that made the character so endearing, the pratfalls, the splashes, the constant water-related misfortune, wasn't effortless. It was uncomfortable work, executed by someone willing to suit up, layer up, and wade into cold water take after take in service of a joke that landed the same way every time. That kind of commitment tends to get overlooked when the end result looks as easy and natural as Gilligan always did. Number 14. The Lagoon was shared with other shows. Studio resources in the 1960s were managed with a sharp eye for efficiency, and the lagoon that served as the castaways' island home was no exception to that rule. Rather than being reserved exclusively for one production, the set was shared across multiple shows shooting at the same studio lot. The carefully constructed tropical environment that felt so unique to viewers at home was, in practical terms, just another facility that the studio rotated between projects based on scheduling needs. This kind of set sharing was standard practice during the era, driven by the economics of network television production. Building and maintaining a specialized location like a lagoon was expensive, and leaving it idle between episodes made little financial sense. Other productions that needed water, shoreline, or outdoor environments could book time on the same set, making adjustments as needed before the next crew came in and set it back up again. For viewers, the island always felt like a singular, specific place, a location that existed purely for these 7 characters and their ongoing situation. The reality was considerably more communal. The same palms, the same shoreline, and the same stretch of water that served as the backdrop for the castaways' daily misadventures was also quietly doing double duty for entirely different shows and stories. It was a working studio asset, not a dedicated sanctuary, and the illusion of exclusivity was just as carefully constructed as every other part of the production. Number 15. The island became Gunsmoke overnight. The versatility of the studio lagoon went even further than sharing it between similar productions. With the right adjustments and a willingness to reframe what the camera could see, the same physical space that housed a tropical island on one day could be transformed into something almost unrecognizable the next. Among the more striking examples of this flexibility was the lagoon's occasional use as a backdrop for Gunsmoke, one of television's most iconic westerns. The leap from a deserted Pacific island to the rugged terrain of the American frontier required creative set dressing rather than any structural changes. Producers and set decorators understood that the camera only needed to believe in a limited slice of the environment at any given moment. Remove the tropical elements from one section of the set, bring in the appropriate props and backdrops, and the same water and shoreline could read as something entirely different depending on how it was framed and lit. It's a testament to just how constructed the reality of early television actually was. 2 shows with nothing in common visually or thematically were filming in the same physical space, sometimes within days of each other. Audiences watching Gilligan's Island and Gunsmoke in the same week had no idea they were looking at the same location, dressed in completely different costumes. The lagoon wasn't just an island, it was whatever the studio needed it to be, and it played its various roles without ever giving the game away. Number 16. Dawn Wells filmed secret footage. Every polished television production has a version of itself that never makes it to air. The unguarded moments, the between-takes laughter, the raw texture of what it actually felt like to be there. For Gilligan's Island, one cast member took it upon herself to preserve exactly that. During the production run, Dawn Wells brought a personal 8mm camera to the set and quietly documented the daily reality of life on the lagoon in a way that no studio crew was tasked with capturing. The footage she gathered was intimate and unscripted. Colleagues relaxed between setups, candid interactions that would never have survived the formality of an official production record. At the time, it was simply a personal project, a way of holding on to something she could see was worth remembering. There was no particular plan for it, no sense that it would eventually become a significant piece of television history. It was just one cast member pointing a camera at the world around her. Years later, that instinct proved to be genuinely valuable. As interest in the show's legacy grew and home media releases began reuniting fans with the series in new ways, Wells's personal footage emerged as a rare window into a side of the production that would otherwise have been completely lost. It offered something no studio archive could provide, a human, unfiltered view of what the set was actually like. In preserving it, she ensured that the people behind the show remained visible as real human beings, not just performers hitting their marks, keeping alive a version of the story that existed only in the spaces between what audiences ever got to see. Number 17. One season had 36 episodes. The scale of television production in the 1960s operated by a logic that feels almost unimaginable by modern standards. Today, a prestige drama might deliver 8 episodes in a season, and consider that a full creative commitment. During the era when Gilligan's Island was in production, the expectation was something else entirely, and the numbers reflect just how relentless that output actually was. At its peak, the show produced 36 episodes in a single season, a volume that would be considered extraordinary today. That pace required the cast and crew to maintain a level of sustained output that left very little room for rest or recalibration. Scripts had to be written, sets dressed, and scenes filmed on a near-constant cycle. The pressure was built into the business model. Networks wanted content to fill their schedules, and the economics of the era rewarded volume in a way that shaped how everyone on a production had to work. The long-term consequence of that grueling pace was something nobody could have predicted at the time. An enormous library of episodes that made the show almost impossible to escape in syndication. When reruns became a dominant part of the television landscape, shows with larger episode counts had a natural advantage, cycling through their material more slowly and staying on air longer. The sheer number of episodes produced during those seasons is a significant reason why the series became such a permanent fixture of American television culture, introducing the castaways to entirely new generations of viewers who had never caught a single episode during its original run. Number 18. DVDs finally revealed lost content. For decades after the original broadcast run ended, the full story of the production existed in fragments, pieces of information that fans and researchers had assembled through interviews, articles, and occasional behind-the-scenes glimpses. Then, home media changed the equation entirely. When Gilligan's Island made its way to DVD, the releases came packaged with something more valuable than just cleaned-up episode transfers. For the first time, material that had never been part of the broadcast experience was made available to anyone who wanted to find it. Bonus features gave fans access to interviews, production context, and footage that had spent years sitting in studio archives. The unaired pilot, already a piece of legendary television history by the time DVDs became widespread, was finally available in a format that any viewer could sit down with at home, rather than something that had only been glimpsed in a single 1992 broadcast. Seeing it in that context, alongside the episodes that followed, made the evolution of the show far easier to understand and appreciate. The DVD era gave older television properties a second life that went beyond mere nostalgia. For this show specifically, it meant that the gap between what audiences had always known and what the production had actually involved could finally be closed, at least partially. Fans who thought they understood the show discovered layers they hadn't known existed. Lost content stopped being lost, and a more complete picture of what the series had been, and almost been, became accessible for the first time, rewarding the loyalty of viewers who had never stopped caring about the island and everyone stranded on it. Number 19. Pilot footage was reused in episodes. Rejected footage rarely disappears entirely in television production. It tends to find a second life in ways that the audience is never meant to notice. The original pilot of Gilligan's Island, despite being shelved before the series launched, didn't simply sit unused in a vault. Producers looked at what had been filmed and identified material that could be quietly folded into the broadcast series without drawing attention to its different origin. Certain scenes and shots from the rejected pilot were cut into later episodes and presented as seamless parts of the show. The practice was driven by straightforward economics. Shooting new footage costs money, and usable material that already existed on film represented a resource that it would have been wasteful to ignore entirely. As long as the recycled footage matched well enough with the surrounding scenes, and as long as no viewer was likely to notice the inconsistency, there was no practical reason not to use it. The fact that the pilot had never aired made the decision even easier, since there was no risk of audiences recognizing the footage from a previous broadcast. For most viewers watching at the time, nothing seemed out of place. But the knowledge transforms the viewing experience for anyone watching today with that detail in mind. Scattered throughout the episodes are fragments of a version of the show that was never supposed to exist, glimpses of a different cast member, a slightly different tone, a take on the material that CBS had already officially rejected. Sharp-eyed viewers willing to look closely enough will find those moments hiding in plain sight. The island held more hidden history than its audience ever realized. Number 20. The Lagoon became a parking lot. Television sets are temporary by nature, built for a purpose, maintained for as long as they're needed, and then repurposed or demolished when the production moves on. Most viewers understand this intellectually, but there's still something jarring about learning what actually happened to a beloved location after the cameras stopped rolling. The Lagoon that had served as the backdrop for 3 seasons of Castaways, multiple TV movies, and years of cultural memory met an ending that carried a particular kind of finality. It was filled in and paved over. The water was gone, the tropical construction dismantled, and the space converted into a parking lot. Studio real estate is valuable, and a specialized Lagoon set that was no longer generating regular production use represented an inefficient allocation of space. The decision was practical, entirely in keeping with how studio infrastructure has always been managed, and completely indifferent to the sentimental weight of what was being erased. The contrast is almost too stark to sit with comfortably. The place where an audience had mentally located 7 stranded castaways for years, the setting that had been dressed, lit, and filmed to suggest tropical isolation, became one of the most ordinary and unglamorous things imaginable. There's no marker, no preserved corner of the original set, nothing that acknowledges what once existed there. For fans who grew up with the show, learning this detail lands with a quiet weight that's hard to shake. It's the kind of ending that says something honest about the nature of television production. The magic was always manufactured, and when the manufacturing stopped, the magic went with it. Number 21. The castaways were finally rescued. For anyone who had followed the original series through 3 seasons and an abrupt cancellation, one question had lingered for over a decade without an answer. Would the castaways ever actually get off the island? The sudden end of the show had left that resolution permanently out of reach until 1978, when a TV movie finally gave audiences the ending the original series had never been allowed to deliver. After years of waiting, the rescue that had always felt just out of reach was finally put on screen. The film brought back most of the original cast and picked up the story as though the years between had simply been another stretch of island time. For fans who had grown up watching reruns, seeing the characters finally leave the island carried a genuine emotional charge. It wasn't just the resolution of a plot point. It was the closing of something that had been left unfinished in a way that had quietly bothered viewers for years. The reunion gave the franchise a sense of completion it had badly needed, and seeing familiar faces back in those familiar roles felt like a genuine gift to the audience that had never stopped caring. The TV movie performed well enough to confirm that the audience for these characters hadn't gone anywhere. It proved that a show canceled without ceremony could still hold enough goodwill to bring viewers back more than a decade later, simply by finally answering the question it had left open. Closure, it turned out, was something audiences were genuinely willing to show up for, and the castaways' long-delayed rescue became one of the more memorable moments in the history of television reunion films. Number 22. The island turned into a resort. Getting rescued was only the beginning. Once the 1978 TV movie had delivered the long-awaited departure from the island, producers faced a question that nobody had needed to consider during the original run. What do these characters actually do next? The answer, when it arrived in a follow-up film, took the franchise in a direction that few fans could have predicted. Rather than leaving the island behind entirely, the castaways returned, this time to convert their former prison into a tropical resort. The concept was a deliberate attempt to evolve the premise while keeping the setting that audiences associated with the show. By turning the island into a business venture, the follow-up found a way to bring the familiar location back without simply repeating the original stranded castaway format. It was an unusual creative pivot, trading the helplessness of the original series for something more entrepreneurial, and the shift in tone was noticeable enough that longtime fans had strong opinions about whether it worked. Reactions were mixed. Some appreciated the effort to take the story somewhere new, while others found the resort concept too far removed from what had made the show work in the first place. The tension between preserving what audiences loved and giving them something they hadn't seen before is one that revival projects rarely resolve cleanly, and this one was no exception. Still, the attempt itself said something interesting about the franchise's ambition. These characters weren't just nostalgia pieces to be dusted off and put back exactly as found. There was a genuine effort to imagine them moving forward into something unexpected. Number 23. The Globetrotters landed on the island. Television crossovers have a long history of bringing unlikely combinations together in the name of entertainment, but few pairings feel quite as unexpected in retrospect as the one that landed the Harlem Globetrotters on a deserted island alongside the castaways. The famous basketball entertainers appeared in one of the later TV movies, bringing their signature brand of comic showmanship into a setting that had no logical reason to contain them, and somehow making it work well enough that the film found its audience anyway. The crossover reflected a broader creative approach that the franchise had begun to embrace as it moved further from its original format. With each revival project, the producers seemed increasingly willing to reach for unusual ideas that would have felt out of place in the original run. The Globetrotters' appearance was perhaps the most striking example of that willingness, a collision of two distinct pop culture institutions that belonged to completely different corners of the entertainment world, yet shared enough broad comedic appeal to occupy the same screen without it feeling completely impossible. For younger viewers in particular, the combination held a specific appeal. The Harlem Globetrotters were a television presence in their own right during the 1970s and 1980s, appearing in animated series and variety programming that made them familiar to exactly the audience likely to be watching a Gilligan's Island TV movie. The crossover wasn't accidental. It was a calculated attempt to refresh the franchise's appeal by borrowing energy from another beloved institution. Whether it succeeded depended entirely on who was watching, but as a piece of television history, it remains genuinely one of a kind. Number 24. Ginger was recast for the movies. When the reunion films began bringing the original cast back together, one notable absence stood out immediately to anyone paying attention. Tina Louise, whose complicated relationship with the role had been an open secret for years, chose not to return for the TV movies. The character of Ginger was too central to the ensemble to simply write out, which meant the production had to find someone willing to step into one of television's most recognizable roles, knowing that every viewer would be making the comparison in real time. Judith Baldwin took on the part for the reunion films, bringing her own interpretation to a character that had been defined by someone else for years. It was an inherently difficult position. Audiences who had grown up with Tina Louise's version of Ginger came to the films with a fixed image of how the character looked, moved, and delivered her lines. And any deviation from that template was going to register as a change, whether the new performance was strong or not. Baldwin committed to the role regardless, stepping into a situation where the odds of universal acceptance were never particularly high. The recasting inevitably shifted the group dynamic, even if only in subtle ways. Ensemble chemistry is built over time through shared experience, and replacing one element, particularly one as visually prominent as Ginger, introduced a variable that the other cast members had to work around. Louise's absence was never fully explained to audiences in the films themselves, which left the replacement feeling slightly unresolved for viewers who cared about such continuity. It stands as one of the more striking what might have beens in the show's long and complicated history. Number 25. Cartoons kept the island alive. Long after the original series had left prime time and the reunion films had delivered their various attempts at closure, the franchise found an unexpected new life in animation. Beginning in the mid-1970s, the world of the island was reimagined in cartoon form, introducing the premise to a generation of younger viewers who might never have encountered the live-action version. The animated series kept the core characters intact while adapting the humor and situations to fit the conventions of Saturday morning television. The transition to animation allowed the franchise to go places the original show never could. Stories could become more fantastical, situations more exaggerated, and the physical comedy pushed further than any live set would permit. For a premise already built on absurdity, 7 people perpetually failing to escape a single island, the animated format was actually a surprisingly natural fit. It amplified what the original had always done best while stripping away the logistical constraints of live production, opening up storytelling possibilities that the original cast and crew could only have imagined. What the animated chapters of the franchise ultimately demonstrated was the unusual durability of a concept that critics had once dismissed as too thin to sustain interest. Across live-action episodes, reunion films, and multiple animated series spanning nearly 2 decades, the core idea proved remarkably resistant to exhaustion. New audiences kept finding it, older audiences kept returning to it, and the island kept generating stories. For a show that was canceled without a proper ending, Gilligan's Island managed to accumulate one of the more improbable and genuinely earned legacies in the history of American television. What started as a simple comedy about 7 people stuck on an island turned into something far more layered than anyone involved could have anticipated. Behind the cheerful theme song and the slapstick misadventures lay hidden casting decisions, political jokes buried in a boat's name, freezing lagoon water, and a set that was quietly demolished and paved over without ceremony. The show that critics dismissed as too lightweight to matter ended up outlasting most of the programming that surrounded it. 3 seasons on air became decades of cultural presence through syndication, reunion films, animated spin-offs, and rediscovered footage that kept pulling new audiences back to the island. Very few shows canceled without a proper ending have managed to generate that kind of sustained afterlife, and fewer still have done it while remaining as genuinely watchable and quietly surprising as this one turned out to be. If this video brought back some memories or revealed something you didn't know, go ahead and hit like and subscribe for more deep dives into the shows and films that shaped television history. Which of these secrets caught you most off guard? Drop it in the comments below.